California's Gold is produced in association with KCET Los Angeles and is seen statewide on California Public Television. This series is endorsed by the California Teachers Association, the California School Boards Association, and the California Library Association. It was a huge undertaking, a project that took years to complete and ended up being one of the greatest achievements of the American people in the 19th century. We're talking about the first Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad that stretched from Omaha, Nebraska in the east to Sacramento, California in the west. Over 1,700 miles of track that had to be laid in all kinds of extreme weather conditions in some of the harshest landscape in the country. Tunnels blasted out of hard rock, trestles and bridges built, and mountains cut away. It was a project that captured the imagination of the entire country. And when the two railroads, the Central Pacific building from the west and the Union Pacific building from the east, actually met at Promontory Point, Utah in May 1869, there was cause for celebration and a ceremony that to this day is one for the history books. All the dignitaries were there, including the already legendary Leland Stanford from California. And the ceremony consisted of two locomotives coming together from different directions, and the driving of the golden spikes to mark the momentous occasion.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Harkness of California.
Ladies and gentlemen,
the photographs taken that day are classics. In fact, every year the National Park Service reenacts the famous event, including the driving of the spikes. Question is, what happened to those ceremonial spikes? Where are those things? Well, that's what this adventure is all about, as we go in search of the spikes, a search which has a surprise ending. To find out more about that historic event, we have come to the California State Railroad Museum in Old Town Sacramento. We're meeting up with Kyle Wyatt, who knows everything there is to know about the Transcontinental Railroad. And Kyle, how big a deal was it when this railroad was actually completed?
Well, I'll tell you, it was huge. It was the world's first instantaneous event from coast to coast. They had actually wired up the silver spike hammer and the ceremonial gold spike so that when they touched together, that completed the circuit instantly from coast to coast. There were cannons that were set off, bells rang all across the country based on this connection on the telegraph.
So the telegraph, when Leland Stanford hit the spike, it set off this telegraph message that went all over the country.
Exactly. The only thing that I could compare it to was the landing on the moon 100 years later.
So the event itself, the actual ceremony itself, ended up being a piece of history as well as the completion of the railroad.
Very much so. It was celebrated. There are pictures, there are newspaper accounts all across the country about the celebrations and events that are going on in commemoration of this singular event.
And here it is, right here on the wall of the Railroad Museum. This is the photograph I grew up seeing, I think in textbooks, but certainly in a lot of books. This famous photograph of was this the Central Pacific? Central Pacific and Union Pacific, the two engines coming together out in the middle of the country, signifying the completion of the railroad. But, as with all things historical, Kyle has blown the cover on this photograph and has disappointed me greatly because this is not what it appears to be, is it, Kyle?
Well, actually it's not. It is the most widely known photograph from the event. It is the signature event, but it is taking place after the event is over. Most of the officials have retired to their car, the gold spike has already been removed, and here it is. The two construction bosses and the two locomotive engineers have brought their engines together. Everybody gathers around for this picture.
So this was made after the ceremony?
After the ceremony was over.
And you told me that out of all these people in this picture, you only know the names of 4 of these people.
Yep.
These 2 fellows were the 2 construction bosses.
Yes.
And these 2 fellows with the liquor up here, handing it back and forth, are the 2 engineers from the 2 locomotives.
That's right. And all of the rest of these people, we don't have any names for.
But you pointed out one that's kind of historically interesting in there.
Indeed. Right in here, we have a Native American, and you can see his braids there. So right in the middle of all this crowd, there's a Native American right there with everybody else celebrating the completion.
Now, where were the Chinese? Because they built this railroad in large part.
Well, the Chinese had been very important in the railroad. They had actually been selected to carry forward the last rail for the Central Pacific, a special crew of 8 Chinese.
And we have the picture right here.
Mm-hmm.
These are the Chinese kind of with their backs to the camera, but they're in the photograph.
They are in the photograph.
And what were they doing in this photograph?
The photographer was taking a picture of the last rail having just been laid by the Chinese crew.
Okay, so there was a last rail.
There was a last rail.
There was a last tie
last
that was
tie.
Famous, wasn't there?
Yes.
It was made out of
billiard table maker, and it had been brought up for the ceremony specifically.
All right, now where is the last tie, the last rail tie?
The tie, unfortunately, has not survived. It was in the offices of the Southern Pacific Railroad in San Francisco in April of 1906.
Uh-oh.
In the earthquake and fire, and the offices were burned, and the tie along with it.
Okay, so the historic polished tie made out of
California Laurel.
Laurel is gone. It burned up in the San Francisco earthquake.
It did.
And fire.
Yes.
Right over here, you just pointed this out to me. This is fascinating. This is a slice of the original last rail.
That's correct.
So what happened to the rest of the last rail?
Well, it was probably sliced up into other little pieces and handed out.
But that's all we know that remains of the last rail.
That's the only one that I know of.
All right, now we get to what's really interesting, the spikes themselves. Because as part of this ceremony, they drove in these spikes. Tell us about the spikes.
Okay, there were actually 4 last spikes in the ceremony made out of precious metal. There was a gold spike given by David Hughes, who was a big developer in San Francisco and a personal friend of Leland Stanford. And he thought it very, very important to have some token for this grand event, and so he commissioned this spike to be made.
All right, gold spike number 1.
Okay. There was a second gold spike that was provided by a San Francisco newspaper. There was also a silver spike produced to represent Nevada, and there was a 4th spike made out of 3 metals. It was iron, clad with silver, and crowned with gold to represent Arizona.
Okay, so part of this ceremony was that each one of the respective railroads, Stanford representing the Central Pacific and Durant representing the Union Pacific, they got the hammers and they tapped these spikes. They weren't really working very hard on this, were they?
No, what had they done? Because the precious metal spikes would be damaged if you really tried to drive them, they had augured 4 holes into the laurel tie, and the 4 spikes were slipped into those holes. And so then they would ceremoniously tap each of the spikes.
And that's what started off, the telegraph.
Right. Stanford took 2 spikes on his rail, and Durant took the other 2 spikes on the other rail. So there are 2 rails, 4 spikes, and each of them had their own spike hammer.
We've got a picture here of Stanford and Durant representing the 2 railroads standing here with the hammers.
That's right.
And that's right after or right before the ceremony?
We believe that's right after the ceremony. They have just finished tapping the spikes, and now they're standing posing for the pictures.
You know, there were lots of pictures made that day, weren't there? And it's a little confusing because you've got several different photographers taking pictures at several times during the day.
There's actually 3 photographers up there.
So they knew ahead of time that this was something that needed to be preserved in history by photograph.
This was a very big event that many people came up from Salt Lake City, from Ogden, and from the area up to the ceremony. Many of the people that we see in the photographs are not the workers, but are actually local residents of the area who have come in by train in order to witness this grand event.
I'm just looking at this one. What is this one? They're the 2 engines. Who are all these people?
Again, some of these are workers, many of these are just people who are coming up for the event.
And what is this one?
Okay, this one is a gathering. Many of these are Union Pacific officials in front of the Union Pacific train, standing right there.
And this one is more artistic.
Yes, this one, again, is standing on the Central Pacific engine, looking over to the site.
And this is this like maybe a day before with the workers kind of standing there waiting on the engines to get there?
It's actually the morning before.
The morning before.
And you can see the gap in the rails.
Right here.
Right there. There's the gap where the last 2 rails are put in.
So they had this whole thing choreographed, didn't they?
To an extent. They had actually planned for it to be 2 days earlier, but the Union Pacific train was delayed because a bridge washed out, and they actually had to push their car across the bridge and get a new locomotive to come up to Promontory.
There are all kinds of stories behind not only, of course, the building of the railroad, which is a mammoth story to build this railroad across America, but the actual event that day.
It's incredible, and you can go on and on and on about all these fascinating little details about the event and the day and what all happened there.
All right, question then. And I know part of the answer, but we know what happened to the original tie. It burned up in the San Francisco earthquake and fire. We know what happened to the original rail. At least we got a slice of it right here.
That's right.
Question is, what happened to those 4 spikes? And I know where 2 of them are.
That's right.
What happened to the other 2?
Well,
don't give away where 2 of them are.
Okay. 2 spikes, as you know, are preserved. A 3rd spike, the Arizona spike, is presently displayed at the Union Pacific Museum in Council Bluffs.
Okay.
The 4th spike from the San Francisco newspaper seems to be lost.
It's kind of out there somewhere.
We don't know what has become of that one.
But we know where 2 of the spikes are.
Yes, you
and
do.
You've got us all fired up about all of this history and all of these wonderful photographs and this big event which happened on
May 10th, 1869.
1869. We are now going to go in search of 2 of those spikes, the gold spike and the silver spike.
That's right.
They're right here, safe and sound, somewhere in California. And that somewhere is here on the campus of Stanford University in Palo Alto. We have been assured that 2 of those historic spikes are right inside this beautiful old historic building, the Cantor Arts Center. Okay, we're standing here with Margaret Kimball, who is the university archivist here at Stanford. And Margaret, we're excited because this is our first look at 2 of those 4 historic spikes. Point out for us exactly what we're looking at. I can tell one of them's gold.
This is the gold, and this is the silver spike.
Okay, now the gold spike has some engravings on it. This is the one that David Hughes, kind of the PR mastermind, came up with and for Leland Stanford to drive into the tie.
That's correct. He came up with the idea of the gold spike and also the idea of attaching telegraph wires to the iron spike to transmit the fact that the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed.
Okay, now these two spikes are obviously collector's items and are prized possessions here in the museum, right?
That's correct.
You have lots of people wanting to come by and look at it.
Well, we have a lot of visitors who make a special trip to come see the spike, and also the children in the area certainly enjoy coming to see it.
School kids want to see it, the gold spike, and this is the silver spike from Nevada.
That's right. That's the one from Nevada.
Okay, and we should point out the other two, as we learned at the Railroad Museum. One is at the Union Pacific Railroad Museum in the Midwest, and the other is just out there somewhere. I'm sure you all would like to find that one as well, wouldn't you?
Well, sure.
Add it to the collection.
Right.
All right, now usually there's a case over this.
That's correct.
You don't want people coming in here and bothering your spikes.
No, not lifting it up and checking it, so it is covered with a cover.
All right, so today we have removed the cover. I'm wearing the gloves. Jeff, come on in, because you're wearing your gloves too. And we're going to actually, look how he handles that thing. Like a baby.
Here you go.
And there, boy, it's heavy.
It is, it is.
Do we know how heavy this thing is?
I think it's a little over 14 ounces.
Wow.
It's high quality gold.
This, when you say high quality, do we know?
I believe it's 18 karat.
Wow, that is, I've never held a gold spike before. How long am I allowed to hold it in my hand?
I'll help you out.
Obviously not very long. It goes back into the collection. This is very exciting, and you can't help but be a little overwhelmed by a sense of history when you're here looking at this and realizing what an important part of American history these two spikes and this railroad were.
That's true. It was a complete change in the transportation possibilities for the United States.
Yeah, and there's something about just standing here and looking at those things, and I want to touch it one last time. They've got some inscriptions on them. We have the context of the photographs here where it all happened. This has been an absolutely wonderful experience to see, touch, and hold ever so shortly one of those original gold spikes. Well, the adventure continues, and this gold spike story turns out to be a story that just keeps on giving, because I didn't think it could get any better than our experience over at the museum on the Stanford campus, where I actually got to hold the gold spike. But we have now been called back, urgently called back here to the Railroad Museum in Sacramento, because, Kyle, there's been a brand new spike development. What has happened?
Well, the Railroad Museum has acquired another gold spike from the David Hughes family.
Wait a minute, another gold spike in addition to the ones we've already talked about?
That's right, another spike that they kept as their own personal memento of the great events at Promontory.
So wait a minute, when these original spikes were made, David Hughes, who was the friend of Leland Stanford and talked him into doing the spikes in the first place, made another one just for his own family, for his own personal use.
That's exactly what we believe. It's true.
There's another spike.
There is another spike. There's a fifth spike.
You're calling it the
lost spike.
The lost spike. And here to tell us about the lost spike is Stephen Drew. You're the chief curator here.
That's correct.
And you are excited about this lost spike. Tell us, well, how did you find out about it? It's been hidden all these years, hasn't it?
Well, it turns out in spring that a brother and sister, fifth-generation descendants of David Hughes, decided to take this piece off their mantle and to consign it to a Southern California dealer, along with some other artwork for sale.
Now, wait a minute. It had been on their mantle since the 1860s.
Been in the family for 5 generations. They knew what it was. As children, they were told they couldn't touch it or play with it, and they finally concluded it was time to put it up for sale.
All right, now how did the state of California get it? Because I understand there was some heavy competition.
There was. Fortunately, we have some very good colleagues at the Smithsonian Institution, and they tipped us off that it was up for sale. We were competing against Stanford University, a private collector, and the threat that it might go up on eBay or in public auction.
You can't put the lost spike on eBay.
So it's starting in spring. Extensive research, a good deal of study, conversations with jewelers on how to authenticate a piece like this, and then fairly stringent negotiations. And it consummated in our acquiring the spike in November.
Okay, here we go, because we have an armed guard right over here. His gun is at the ready, right, officer? Absolutely. We have the briefcase here, and we're going to look at, for the first time seen by the public, the lost spike. Oh boy.
Isn't that beautiful?
Oh boy. Let's put it on the... Oh. Now the first thing you notice is that this spike is longer than the spikes that we have seen before. It's, look at this, we've got a whole extra piece down here. What's that?
Which is called the sprue. And when the mold is made for this and the molten gold is poured in, you pour some extra material into the gate in order to make sure that this is fully loaded down here at the end. So this is the residue, the sprue. And there was one of these on the gold spike at Stanford that was subsequently broken off and melted down and made into all kinds of commemorative watch fobs and rings and whatnot. But ours is unique. It hasn't been driven. It still has the original sprue attached.
So the sprue was taken off the other spikes.
That's
this
correct.
one still has it on there.
That's correct.
And it's engraved as well.
It is. The spike at Stanford says May 8th, 1869. They thought that's when the event was going to be. But it was the first time a train had ever been late, and Dodge's train didn't arrive for a couple days. So the event took place on May 10th. Our spike was probably engraved after the event because it has the right date on it of May 10th, 1869.
Wow. And the high point of this event right here, I'm wearing the same gloves I wore at Stanford when they let me hold their spike. And I've got these gloves on now because these are probably the only gloves in California that have held 2 gold spikes.
Probably the only ones in the United States.
Absolutely. So can you just, I don't want to pick it up. Look at this. Here we go.
Don't drop it. Don't sneeze now.
Oh my gosh. And it's a little heavier because you've got the sprue
attached to it, yes.
And again, you were overwhelmed with a sense of history.
This is an icon of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is as important as the Liberty Bell is to American history. And we have it here now at the California State Railroad Museum.
And how do you put a price tag on this? This guard is here, and look, he's hovering right over us too. State Park Ranger, excuse me.
You can't put a price on it.
It's not just the gold itself, is it?
It's priceless. It's absolutely priceless.
Just because of its place in history.
And particularly right here in front of the last spike painting, the lost spike in front of the last spike. Ground was broken for the Transcontinental Railroad just a couple hundred yards from where we're standing. This is historic soil, and what better place to exhibit this?
So it's come home.
Absolutely.
The lost spike, because all the photos are of the last spike, meaning the last spike in the railroad.
Right.
This is the lost spike.
In front of the last spike painting. Doesn't get any better than that.
Wow. Let's put it right down and take a look at it. This beautiful lost spike. This 5th spike, which has been hidden for so many years and is truly such a fine example of California's gold. It's come home where it belongs, right here in the State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. Well, hello everybody, I'm Huell Hauser, and I sure hope you enjoyed this adventure as we discovered the lost golden spike. And if you'd like to go on this adventure again, share it with family or friends, or perhaps donate a copy to your local school or library. It's available on DVD. All you have to do is call 1-800-266-5727, and we'll be glad to send it to you right away.